So thank you, Robert, for this very, very kind and generous introduction and for the invitation. And thank you also for so subtly covering over the fact that I ended up in the other part of the time. So that is why we're having this academic quarter. And I think you said in a nice way that, you know, we are flexible there sometimes. But I apologize for that. But now I'm here, and I'm so happy to be here, to be back in Heidelberg. It was 25 years ago that I was here as a doctoral student. And I'm as some of you know, we will be spending a couple of days here. The big research program. Several of the colleagues of that program, they are coming down tomorrow, and Thursday, Friday we're having a workshop. So I also want to express my excitement for this emerging collaboration between our research program and the CAP as well. Okay, so let's lose no time. And let's see. Yeah, super. Now, the idea that the world is coming to an end has never been far away from culture or in cultures rooted in the biblical tradition. In a longue durée perspective, the sense that the end is drawing near seems to have been the rule rather than the exception. Yet it's difficult to deny that the past decades have been particularly ripe of events that seem to herald the end. This heightened sense of urgency is reflected in the notion of polycrisis, which is regularly invoked today to describe how the world's most pressing challenges are intersecting in ways that mutually exacerbate each other's effects. More broadly, the sense of urgency is reflected also in how apocalyptic tropes and images have become a staple of popular culture as well as in the media. Although the theological sources of these tropes and images are rarely made explicit, their ubiquity, again, is a reminder of how age-old ideas of the end times have never gone away from cultures steeped in the biblical imaginary. Now, to point this out is not to suggest that there is nothing essentially new with what is happening today. While there are critics that are keen to argue that the frequent reference to apocalyptic themes merely recycle old alarmist tropes, there is no getting around the fact that we are currently experiencing an array of phenomena that are exceeding earlier trends and patterns in an accelerating rate. Now, if it's true that our times are facing challenges of apocalyptic proportions, what should be the proper philosophical response to this situation? This is the question that I would like to engage with in this lecture, and I will do so in a very special manner. More specifically, I will engage with one of the more creative and thought-provoking efforts of recent years to respond to the current predicament of the world, namely the apocalyptic political theology proposed by British-American philosopher of religion, Tommy Lynch. Now, what makes this engagement special is that Tommy Lynch is not just a thinker among others in this context. First of all, Tommy is a former fellow here at the CAPAS who has contributed essentially to make it into the flourishing research center it is today. Second, and even more important, Tommy is a very dear colleague and a good friend of mine with whom I've been co-philosophizing now for over almost 15 years. And last but not least, we have the privilege of having Tommy as a guest here at the CAPAS tonight, which of course makes it even more irresistible to engage with his thinking. Now, in particular, I will engage with the book you see here on the slide, which came out in 2019, right? Although I will also relate to more recent articles. Now, Tommy Lynch, and I will now shift back to Lynch to give this lecture a more formal character, discerns in this works two basic ways of responding philosophically to the current predicament of the world. One possibility is to agree that the challenges of the world seem intractable, but to worry about the implications of calling for an end to the world. Such an approach would focus on transforming or reforming the world, for example, by developing more sustainable ways of living or struggling to overcome social injustices. However, ranging from liberal incrementalism to various practices of resistance against the dominant world order, the problem with such efforts is that they continue to draw on the resources of the world and thereby ultimately to cement its structures. Now, the other way of responding is to acknowledge that the world cannot be put right or fixed. It means recognizing that the injustices and violence of the world are not merely incidental, but part of its very constitution. The only proper approach for anyone who shares these premises is to stop investing in the world and start wishing for its end. Now, this is what Lynch describes as an apocalyptic response to the world, albeit with the qualifier plastic or immanent. In other words, to respond apocalyptically to the apocalyptic challenges of the world should not be confounded with traditional evangelical or traditional theological ideas of rejecting this world in favor of another world. An immanent apocalyptic approach contents itself instead with rejecting the world tout court. And this is how Lynch phrased it. The plastic apocalypticism developed here distills apocalypticism into its negative essence. It is an anarchic unleashing more than a planned imposition. Nothing is imposed because there is not yet the position from which to think new beginnings. For now, the end is enough. Now, the reason why I wish to engage with Lynch's apocalyptic political theology is not only that it offers one of the more original efforts to reflect philosophically on the challenges of our time. More importantly, I share Lynch's concern about the state of the world as well as his diagnosis that violence and tragedy are inherent to this world and not anything that will be overcome if we only trust in democratic processes and new forms of technology. Yet there is a major difference in our approaches, which is made clear in Lynch's critique of my own effort to respond to the current state of the world in the book which was mentioned by Robert, which came out in 2016, the one titled Divining History. To tease out our differences and continue the fruitful conversation that we have had over many years, I shall proceed dialectically. So this is the structure of the lecture you see here. First, in the first part, I will offer a brief recapitulation of my argument in Divining History, including my critique of what I already then referred to as apocalyptic tendencies within contemporary political philosophies. Second, I will engage with Lynch's perceptive critique of my position, which I admit captures several weak spots of my argument. However, I will also argue that he leaves out the most important element of my critique of apocalyptic approaches, which concerns the tendency to escape what I described as the material complexity of concrete political life. Finally, and in the third part, I will attempt to raise, and this is kind of dialectical synthesis, although we'll see how much we agree. I will attempt to raise our ongoing debate on political theology to a new level. While agreeing that the urgency of our times calls for more radical approaches than cautious dialogue or reformist adaptation, I think we have come to a point where we need to raise anew the question about what radicality really entails in face of the kind of challenges we are up against at this moment in history. And this brings me to the first part. As is often the case with monographs, Divining History had a long prehistory and was first conceived during the early years of the 2000s, just a few years after my first Heidelberg séjour. Marked by the aftermath of 9/11, these years saw a fundamental shift in tune within academic political philosophy. Perhaps most aptly captures by Zizek's provocative formulation, democracy is not to come but to go, pointedly directed at Derrida's notion of a democracy to come. The shift in tone indicated a growing frustration with the traditional academic left's inability to confront the repressive structures of the liberal world order. In a time when basic democratic rules were being violated and the double standards of Western governments became all the more apparent, rosy talk of democracy as a universal model not only rang hollow, but manifested the self-defeating arrogance of the West. Now, it's against this background that thinkers like Slavoj Žižek, Alain Badiou, Georgia Agamben, and many others called for a more far-reaching critical discussion of the very premises of political liberalism. Now, this also explains the renaissance of Carl Schmitt around this time, and with Schmitt, the revitalization of political theology. Drawing on Schmitt's theory of the state of exception, Agamben in particular pointed to how liberal politics routinely relied on exceptional measures and thereby operated within a framework it could not justify. However, while Schmitt was ultimately interested in defending an extra political authority, represented by the sovereign, his theory was now invoked as a distorting mirror to the subtle absolutism that was currently undermining Western democracies. Now, this is not to say that that any of the thinkers referred to here, Žižek and the others, opted for a restoration or ongoing critical maintenance of democracy, as suggested by Derrida's democracy to come. On the contrary, if the state of exception, in Agamben's words, increasingly tended to appear as the dominant paradigm of government in contemporary politics, then the only way forward would be to push the existing order to its limits. Now, after this brief detour into the political philosophical landscape of the early 2000s, let me return now to divining history. Although a significant inspiration for the book was these recent trends in political theology or philosophy, the study was ultimately motivated by a more far-reaching interest in the theology of history. More specifically, I was interested in the way in which the longing for redemption has been construed in relation to temporality in the two traditions that spring from the ancient Hebrew biblical texts, that is, Judaism and Christianity. Anyone who has studied these traditions more closely knows that they are both profoundly messianic traditions in the sense that they carry a hope for a coming redemption. Yet there are differences between as well as within the two traditions, precisely within regard to temporality. A fruitful way to capture these differences, again, both between but also importantly within the two traditions, which I adopt throughout divine history, is the distinction made by Gershom Scholem between restorative versus apocalyptic tendencies within Messianic thinking in this very famous essay, Classical Even. So while, and this is again according to Scholem, the restorative tendency emphasizes continuity, connecting Messianic redemption to an ongoing transformation of creation through the work of justice, the apocalyptic tendency conceives of redemption as a cataclysmic event that causes a rupture in the temporal continuity of history. Especially during times of oppression and hardship, the apocalyptic proclamation of an end to evil has offered consolation and hope to those struggling to make sense of a world in which injustice prevails. For this reason, Scholem writes, we must never underestimate the political and social value of apocalypticism. Nonetheless, it is also true that apocalyptic enthusiasm throughout history has bred turmoil and sometimes even greater despair as proclaimed promises of redemption have failed to materialize. It's against this background that we should understand the restorative attempts among both Jewish and Christian thinkers to temper the anarchic and antinomian impulses of apocalyptic messianism. And the two paradigmatic examples would, of course, be Maimonides in the Jewish tradition and Augustine in the Christian tradition. Although there are other interpretations of Augustine as well, but that's another chapter. Now, while Schollem's distinction between restorative and apocalyptic forms of Messianism is useful for historical analysis of both Jewish and Christian theologies of history, it can also be used as a tool or typology for interpreting discourses on temporality and redemption more widely beyond traditional theological settings. This is how I used it in the final parts of Divine History, where I engaged with different tendencies in recent political philosophy. More specifically, I focused here on the shifting tone just described from the dominant left liberal tendency of the final decades of the 20th century to the call for more radical approaches in the wake of 9/11. To exemplify the former tendency, I engaged in a close reading of the conversations on religion and politics that took place on Capri in 1994, involving, among others, Derrida, Gianni Vattimo, and Eugenio Trias. To exemplify the latter tendency, I turned in the final chapter to the then very recent and ongoing debate on St. Paul, represented by Agamben, Badiou, and Zizek. Now, in keeping with Schollem's typology, I characterize the former discourse as restorative and the latter as apocalyptic, and I ended the book by defending the restorative option against the apocalyptic. Now, in which sense could these thinkers and the debate on Paul be characterized as apocalyptic? Well, the question is warranted, especially since none of these thinkers use the terms as a designation for their own intellectual endeavors. As many of you probably know, also Agamben explicitly defines his reading of Paul as non-apocalyptic. Now, relying on Schollem's characterization, I nonetheless argued that the political theologies of Agamben, Badiou, and Zizek are apocalyptic in central respects. Despite significant differences, all three emphasize the disruptive and antinomian nature of the messianic event. Discarding any form of incrementalism, they also share the assumption that the present world order must be rejected in its entirety for redemption to be achieved. This is what is implied, of course, in Zizek's rhetorical twist that democracy is not to come but to go, or more soberly in Agamben's statement that from the real state of exception in which we live, it's not possible to return to the state of law, for at issue now are the very concepts of state and law. And you'd find similar formulations in Badiou too. Now, although the radicalized tune in political philosophy was both warranted and desirable in a time of growing democratic deficit, I nonetheless found the approaches of Agamben, Badiou, and Zizek problematic. To summarize my critique in a few points, it related firstly to the absence of plausible alternatives to the parliamentary democracy that was being rejected. If the vital critique of democracy is to have any higher purpose than social overthrow for the sake of overthrow, I ended the book by writing, it must simply have an idea, however open and provisional, of what it's seeking to achieve. At the deeper level, my concern was also about authority and legitimacy. Which institutions and practices should provide the basis for justice in a post-judicial society? And what, in the first place, justifies the emancipation of political power from existing legal and political organs? Now, the lack of reflection on these questions, combined with an open flirtation with Schmittian decisionism, seem little to offer to prevent radical egalitarianism from tipping over into anti-democratic elitism. Now, having leveled my critique of these tendencies, I concluded Divine History by arguing that restorative forms of political messianism are better suited to respond to the complex and conflictual political reality of today. In particular, I relied on Derrida's elaboration of the messianic in several of his late key texts, notably Spectres of Law and Force of Law. Now, to be sure, Derrida too was concerned with the rights violations currently taking place in the name of democracy. It's even fair to say that this was his main preoccupation during the last years of his life. However, in keeping with the idea of deconstruction as it was originally conceived, Derrida maintained the impossibility of placing oneself beyond the system that was being criticized without acquiring precisely the problem of authority and legitimacy. For this reason, he also had little patience with a resistance that in advance positions itself beyond the rule of law. And this is from the Force of Law. The excess over justice over law and calculation, this overflowing of the unrepresentable over the determinable, cannot and should not serve as an alibi for staying out of juridico-political battles within an institution or a state, between institutions or states. Abandoned to itself, the incalculable and giving idea of justice is always very close to the bad, even to the worst, for it can always be reappropriated by the most perverse calculation. Now, the main distinction between a thinker like Derrida and a thinker like Agamben, I contended, was not about their discontent with the dominant economic and social structures of the world. Rather, it was about how to respond philosophically to this situation. While the antinomian rhetoric deployed by Agamben and others by this time tended to, in my interpretation, end up in a quasi-theological fixation on the present and the moment, amounting in the end to little more than preserving status quo, the restorative Messianism of Derrida seemed to avoid this impasse. Being no less radical, it simply insisted that real change takes time and requires continuity. Which brings me to the second part. Now, in the decade that has passed since the publication of Divining History and the 2 decades since I embarked on this long journey, the complexity and conflicts of our global, social and political reality have by no means diminished. As indicated by my earlier reference to the notion of polycrisis, we rather see how various catastrophes aggravate each other at a distressing rate, creating seemingly unsurmountable challenges. If these if these developments shed light on the strong presence of apocalyptic motives in contemporary journalism and popular culture, they are also mirrored in the growing academic interest in apocalypticism, both as an object of critique and as a resource for critical thinking and agency. Within contemporary theology, which is my own field, efforts to engage with apocalyptic traditions range from Catherine Keller's critical confrontation with the destructive potential of apocalyptic motives to Philip Ziegler's exploration of the apocalyptic strand of biblical theology as an inspiration for Christian discipleship. Lynch's apocalyptic political theology should be seen in this light too, that is, as an effort to respond intellectually to the increasingly gloomy predicament of the world. And yet his effort differs significantly from those of both Keller and Ziegler. Whereas Keller is engaging critically with concrete historical manifestations of apocalyptic motives, for example in American right-wing Christianity, Lynch's interest lies in exploring apocalyptic concepts as a resource for critiquing the present world order. So rather than doing theology in the traditional sense of critically elaborating Christian doctrine or Christian teaching, his project is thus affiliated with the renewed political theological discourse that I described in the first part of the lecture. This also distinguishes him from Ziegler, whose championing of an apocalyptic turn in theology represents a more classical approach to Christian doctrine, including the idea of a final redemption inaugurated by God's revelation in Jesus Christ and a kind of transcendent ending to the world. Now, as I indicated already when I started out the lecture, Lynch rejects ideas of the apocalypse as an intervention of a transcendent divine agent. Such ideas are problematic, not only because they tend to downplay human agency and invite to escapism, but also because they rest on the illusory assumption that the antagonisms of this world will one day be resolved. On the contrary, the imminent apocalyptic theology Lynch proposes relies on the recognition that violent structures are an integral part of this world. Now, this is not to say that evil and violence are necessary in an absolute or ontological sense. They are necessary, but only from the vantage point of the present political and economic ordering of the world. If we are willing to abandon this world, then other possibilities become possible. However, unleashing these possibilities requires, in Lynch's words, more than just updating ideas or shifting social attitudes. It involves nothing else than imagining the end of this world. Apocalyptic political theology explores the essentially traumatic process of addressing the antagonisms that constitute the world. These material and social relations cannot be resolved within the world because they are the world. This requires imagining the end of the world, a traumatic end that exceeds the legitimizing discourses of ethics and politics understood in opposition to the political. Such an end is the possibility of other possibilities. Now, on the basis of this statement, it's not hard to see how and why Lynch ends up being at odds with the position I take in divining history, including my concerns about apocalyptic political thinking. The main thrust of his critique is that the restorative forms of messianic thinking that I advocate eventually ends up thwarting genuine political hope. So in defining redemption as an ongoing work on justice rather than a decisive break, restorative messianism still draws on the resources of the existing world order and thereby continues to feed its oppressive mechanisms. The difference in perspective, Lynch concludes, eventually boils down to how we view the present era. Now, if gradual and intra-historical progress within the existing order is capable of rendering the world more just, then Svenungsson is right to emphasize how slow change and the importance of continuity. If something more intrinsic is wrong with the world, then it's necessary to investigate the sources of apocalypticism. Now, confronted with the challenges we are facing at this moment in history, I can see the limits of incrementalism and belief in piecemeal adjustments of the existing order. And although I never actually defended the idea of progress in divine history, I can also see why and how my advocating for a restorative messianism can be read as an endless deferral of the emancipatory event, with the effect that the exploitative structures of this world are just tacitly accepted. But if it's true that we are facing challenges of apocalyptic proportions, challenges that call for more radical responses, this also raises the question of what radicality means in terms of a thinking that is able to generate effective change. Are the only options at hand disinvestment versus endless deferral, or is this a dichotomy that precludes other ways of thinking what radical commitment could entail? I will return to this question in the final section. But before I do so, let me spend a few more minutes spelling out the contrast between Lynch's apocalyptic approach and my own restorative approach as I teased it out in Divine History. In particular, I'd like to return to something I indicated at the outset, namely that I believe that for all the very sharp and good critique, Lynch leaves out the most important element of my critique of apocalyptic tendencies or approaches. And he does so partly through a rhetorical strategy, which is to connect my work to writers like John Gray and Mark Lilla, who I'm actually enjoy very much reading, but who I find extremely problematic for an array of reasons. But we will come back to that conversation. But to connect my work to writers like John Gray and Mark Lilla, Lynch both directly and indirectly indicates that my main concern is the anti-liberalism of more radical thinkers like Agamben and Zizek. However, as I've already made clear, my concern with the neo-Schmittian political theologies of the 2000s was not about their critique of the liberal world order, which I found entirely warranted. Instead, it was, again, about what I described as their lack of materiality, by which I referred to their reluctance to engage in concrete political visions or to consider real political options. Also, as you remember, my concern was about authority and legitimacy. Now, if we affirm radical antinomianism and overthrow of the existing order, then we need to provide some kind of reflection on what or who justifies the emancipation of political power from existing legal and political organs. So how to prevent otherwise the elevation of any arbitrary power into absolute power? Now, although I share Lynch's conviction that the current predicament of the world calls for radical responses, these aspects are also my remaining concerns with the apocalyptic strategy he proposes to tackle the situation we live in, or that we are in at the moment. Let me briefly explain why. Now, like Agamben and several other neo-Schmittian thinkers, Lynch defines political theology as a kind of thinking that is concerned with the realm of the political outside the bounds of politics. In other words, the task of political theology is not to meddle with day-to-day politics and get entangled in ethical political discourses, but to reflect critically on the underlying structural conditions that in the first place decide what is and what can be played out on the concrete political arena. Now, the problem or risk that I see with this confinement of philosophical reflection to the realm of the political is that it allows you to evade any reflection on the relation between a particular conception of the political and the consequences this conception will have for the shape of politics. Thereby, it also allows you to evade the critical considerations and weighing of alternatives that go along with the implementation of any political ideal, including, for example, those of an active pessimism or anarchic unleashing. Now, at this point, Lynch, dear Tommy, will rightly object that I'm blackmailing him by demanding alternatives and concretization, trying to lure him back into reinvesting in this world and thereby cementing its oppressive structures. As you remember, it's precisely this trap of affirmation that Lynch is trying to avoid with this plastic apocalyptic strategy. Now, the thing is that I simply don't think that it's possible, let alone desirable, to avoid choosing between different alternatives. Since even deciding, and this is a very Sartrean twist, even deciding not to choose is a choice that will have concrete political consequences. And if you choose, as a political philosopher, not to spell out the possible consequences of the conceptual ideals and strategies that you are advocating, then it's very likely that someone else will do it for you. Now, let me ponder this last point with reference to my introductory observations about the strong presence of apocalyptic motives in contemporary political rhetoric, popular culture, mass media, and, of course, to be sure, social media. Across all these fields, apocalypticism is today being invoked both as a strategy or method, that is a certain way of building up arguments by means of radical contrasts, decisive breaks, and so on, and as a specific imaginary, that is visions of particular threats and imagined solutions to these threats. For example, you would see on top, this is an election movie that the Sweden Democrats used some years ago. Statsbudget for all of you who don't understand Swedish, but you may guess it's the state budget, and you can of course see the dark threat to the Swedish state budget and who are the forces that are chasing the poor old retired blonde Swedish lady there. So this kind of using the imaginary for specific purposes. Now, against this background, so the problem I see with Lynch's choice to confine his reflections to the strategic or methodological level, avoiding an affirmative prospect, is that his proposed strategy could be coupled with the most diverse imaginaries today, including radical right-wing ideas of anarchic unleashing of the sorts that were played out on the US Capitol in January 21, or more recently during the racist riots in the UK this summer. Now, very importantly, I'm not making the vulgar claim that apocalyptic political theologies, and least of all, of course, Tommy Lynch, is paving the way for far-right violence. Rather, I'm expressing an honest concern that this kind of political philosophical thinking fails to address the challenges that we are up against at this moment. Although I do agree that these challenges call for more radical responses than complacent incrementalism, I see a danger with philosophical discourses on radicalism that deliberately cut them loose from legitimating discourses of ethics and politics. For, again, to refer back to the already quoted words by Derrida, abandoned to itself, the incalculable and giving idea of justice is always very close to the bad, even to the worst, for it can always be reappropriated by the most perverse calculation. And now looking at these images, some of you might, of course, object that, well, hey, those guys, they are not, aiming for justice or truth I mean, these are merely dystopias. But then I would say, oh no, these guys are really convinced that they are serving even the highest divine truth. So that is what makes it so complicated. And I think also this is what has changed and what is rapidly changing across all other disasters in the recent cases. Rapidly growing far-right, populist right, and fascist right movements. And this is a challenge that we need to ponder. Which brings me to my third and final part. And the question of whether there are options, other options at hand beyond incrementalism, say, kind of the dialectical move that I'm trying to follow, so like my original position, kind of incrementalism, and Tommy's disinvestment. So is there a time to, or a way to think productively beyond these alternatives, these dichotomies? This is my last question. And I've titled this Radicality at the End of the World. Now, if it's true that our times are facing challenges of apocalyptic proportions, what should be the proper philosophical response to the question? Well, this was, as you remember, the question I promised to engage with in this lecture. So far, I've discussed two responses, which I've summarized as, or in terms of precisely incrementalism versus disinvestment, and which I've exemplified through different philosophical debates over the past decades. And I think it's important to see each of these debates in the light of their specific geopolitical context. That is, as attempts precisely to respond philosophically to the challenges of their time or their times. Thus, the left liberal tendencies that pervaded the conversations of Capri in 1994 in many ways mirrored the intellectual climates, of course, of the years post-1989. Although these years certainly had their share of violence, it was by and large a time when walls were torn down and bridges were built. We had, of course, the fall of the Eastern Bloc, the fall of the apartheid regime, but also the establishment of a permanent international criminal court in the wake of Balkan and Rwanda. It was, in other words, a time when there were reasons to be hopeful about democratic processes and the potential of international institutions. I think it's in this light that you should see these conversations. In the same way, the shift in tone that took place during the 2000s with thinkers like Zizek and others, Agamben, mirrored, as I've argued, the rights violations and democratic corrosion that happened rapidly in the wake of 9/11. 9/11, although arguably it was already underway. Now, today we find ourselves in yet another historical reality. And it's no coincidence that words such as polycrisis or perfect storm are used to capture the current predicament. Nor is it just an expression of alarmism to say that we are facing challenges of apocalyptic proportions. The world currently experiences the highest number of countries engaged in conflict since World War II, several of which, as you know, display clear genocidal tendencies. In Europe, authoritarianism is steadily on the rise. At present, 7 EU countries have far-right or national conservative parties in governing position, which, again, is unheard of since World War II. And if you happen to take part of the WWF's report 2 weeks ago, you would have learned the shocking news that global wildlife populations have shrunk by an average of 73% in the past 15 years. Just to pick up of a few items on the map behind here. Now, these are facts and not just alarmism or scaremongering. So how, again, to respond to this philosophically? Now, it's not only the urgency of the present state of the world that prompts me to suggest that we raise this question anew, but also the fact that many of the urgencies of our time are of a nature that demand action before it's too late. This was indeed the clearest message sent by the WWF's report, that we still have the chance to reverse many of the disasters we're heading towards, but then we got to do something now. So the question is, what kind of thinking can spur or muster commitment of the sort needed to face up to the urgency of the moment? Now, that incrementalism is not enough today is clear to me. Lynch has argued well for this throughout his works and has convinced me about the limitations of the argument I put forth in Divining History. However, as I tried to show in the previous part of the lecture, I also don't think that this investment is enough to confront the challenges we're up against today. My fear is that such a posture, in its unwillingness to engage with concrete political options and alternatives, risks playing the most dangerous authoritarian forces into their hands. Also, in relation to climate emergency, I find this investment wanting. At a moment in history where there are crucial measures still to be taken to prevent bad to get worse, we no longer have the luxury of indulging in the rhetoric of disinvestment and refusal characteristic of the radical philosophies that set the tune in the wake of 9/11. So it's against this background that I want to suggest that we move beyond the dichotomy between incrementalism and disinvestment and start to explore alternative traditions of radical thinking, more effectively suited to face up to the momentous challenges of the present eras. So, which are these traditions and what do I mean by radicality? Let me start with radicality, which is today often used as a merely formal word, being synonymous with subversive or disruptive tendencies in general. Thus, you would find nihilist and death-dealing practices such as terrorism being described as radical, such as when it's said that someone has undergone radicalization when committing to fascist or Islamist movements. What's happened here is that the word has been detached from any content and any value discourse, becoming an empty signifier. But this has not always been the case. Throughout modern history, being a radical has meant something. It has meant something in terms of specific commitments to distinct values, and it's this something that I think we need to retrieve today. All of which brings me to tradition. More precisely, I want to suggest that it's possible to reconstruct traditions, because they are complex and multifarious, traditions of radicality that run through modernity, and that would include figures like, for example, Heine, Marx, Luxemburg, Buber, Rosenzweig, Benjamin, Bloch, and needless to say, many, many others. Now, reconstructed in this way, radicality is not just about disruption and revolt in general. Instead, it has a social goal with an inclusive plan and is tightly connected to discourses of justice. One may also suggest that these radical traditions have deeper roots and ultimately draw on theological sources, especially the prophetic strand of the biblical legacy with its commitment to the weak and the vulnerable. As many of you would know, there is a whole genre of literature that deals with the family resemblance between Marx and a certain messianic prophetic past. A genre that includes writers from Max Weber and Karl Löwit to Derrida. That's what he's doing in his Spectres of Marx. In various ways, they have all suggested that modern radicalism can be seen as a secularization of biblical prophetism, in keeping with its central motives, concern for the weak and the vulnerable, and justice and righteousness and so on, but at the distance from its original theological assumptions. Now, very interestingly, we find here an argument which is very similar to Schmidt's famous secularization thesis, which stipulates that all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts. However, there is a crucial difference. While Schmidt placed focus on a select number of theological concepts, namely those concepts that Schmidt himself identified as the theological forerunners to his own key political concepts, we find here another application of the secularization thesis based on a different genealogy. And this brings us back to political theology. With the renaissance of Schmidt around the turn of the millennium, political theology very much became tantamount to an interest in precisely the theological concepts that he favored, and consequently a preoccupation with political structures mirroring these particular concepts. As you find in the works of Badiou and Zizek and others, they would be replete with concepts like miracle, grace, sovereignty, and so on. Now, what this other alternative genealogy reminds us of is that the biblical legacy contains other strands, other concepts that may generate different conceptions of the political as well as of politics. Now, recognizing this enables us to pose the question of what a political theology that would draw on these alternative theologies may look like. Now, this is not a hypothetical question, because as some of you may know, this is exactly what happened during the post-war decades when thinkers such as Dorothy Sölle, Jürgen Moltmann, and Johann Baptist Metz sought to retrieve the concept of political theology from Schmidt by elaborating opposing political theologies that instead foregrounded ideals such as solidarity, vulnerability, contrition in relation to the crimes of the recent past, memory, and so on. And it was very clearly inspired by this legacy, mediated through thinkers as Rosenzweig, Benjamin Bloch, and others. Now, why do I find these 20th century theologians fascinating? I don't think that we could merely go back and repeat what they wrote 50 years ago, because as I said a moment ago, each time has its own challenges that need to be responded to. And our challenges are not really those that the haunted decades of the post-Second World War struggled with. Now, in my own efforts to elaborate a political theology that responds to the challenges of our time, I have instead found it productive to return to the more recent writings of the Jewish Marxist thinker Daniel Bensaïd, who passed away almost 50 years ago now, prematurely and sadly. Now, Bensaïd is particularly interesting in this context because he was part of the political philosophical debates that took place in the wake of 9/11, and he was also a close interlocutor, especially of Badiou, with whom he was fairly close friends. And yet he was also a fierce critic of the antinomian tendencies of these debates, which he saw as a betrayal of a more consistent materialist or Marxist position. Now, to get a sense of Bensaïd's unique position, it should be seen in the light both of a long life of Trotskyist Marxist political practice. He was a politician, all of his life, and a deep commitment to a specific strand of Jewish political Messianism and Prophetism, including most of the names you saw on the slide a moment ago. So he would be another contemporary representative of this tradition of radicalism. Now, what I find particularly productive with his thinking is that it allows us to move beyond the dichotomy of incrementalism versus disinvestment. As a radical, Bensaïd had little patience with reformist adaptation, but he also saw the limits of categorical demands for a total overthrow of the existing order. In placing all emphasis on the revolutionary movement, such radicality or radicalism merely tends to breed resignation, as the perfect, complete revolution will always fail to materialize. Drawing instead of a bifurcation of the concept of the permanent revolution, which is prominent especially in Trotskyist Marxist traditions, with especially Walter Benjamin's notion of the redemptive messianic event as incumbent in every second, Bensaïd proposed a different notion of, or concept of, revolutionary temporality. And this, of course, resonates with my original interest in redemption and temporality. And I think this is a key point, we could come back to the conversation, for moving ahead, rethinking what revolutionary temporality may imply. Now, thereby, he also invites to a different way of thinking radicality and what radical commitment may entail. Rather than succumbing to a rhetoric of pure negation of the world, which again comes dangerously close to a certain anti-established rhetoric adopted by the far right, very consciously, of course, radicality becomes a matter of endurance and perseverance, of persisting in the struggle against the relentless order of things, even when immediate results fail to appear. It means, in Bensaïd's words, learning the inevitable revolutionary slowness, which is to recognize that thoroughgoing changes in the direction of justice take time and demand both patience and impatience, an impatient patience, as it were. Now, translated into concrete political terms, such revolutionary slowness or such slow revolutionary practice could involve everything from engaging in local political battles to using creative artistic means to raise people's awareness of the pending ecological crisis. It could also involve engaging in political struggles by way of asserting legal rights and using legal strategies, which may, in fact, prove to be one of the more promising ways of responding to and acting upon some of the most urgent problems of our time. But my point here is not to provide a manual for radical agency. Rather, it's about shifting perspective philosophically. Given, again, the urgency of the present moment, I think we need to turn away from the idea of radicality as disruption and negativity towards an idea of radicality as tenacity, as persistent and hope against all odds. The kind of radicality that is embodied in people who risk their lives as aid workers in today's many war zones, or the senior Swiss ladies who struggled for years to bring home the first ever major climate case against a state, that is the Swiss state, in the European Court of Human Rights earlier this year. Now, these are, for me, ways of carrying on the tradition of radicality referred to a moment ago, and this is what the enactment of a prophetic political theology could entail in practice. Now, I'm reaching my end and my conclusion now, and I will turn back to a more informal tune, because at this moment I can hear Tommy sighing and asking whether retrieving these alternative traditions of radicality really manages to advance our conversation. Doesn't all this talk of endurance and perseverance in the struggle for justice merely, again, amount to reinvesting in the world? Well, I'm afraid it does. And I think we've here reached the point where there is an irreducible difference in perspectives, namely the concept of the world. As I said at the outset, I really do share the diagnosis that violence and tragedy is inherent to the world, and not anything that will be overcome if we only shift social attitudes and update a few ideas. What I don't share is the belief that the world may one day end in favor of another world liberated from violence and tragedy. Now, to be clear, Tommy and I both reject evangelical apocalyptic fantasies of otherworldly redemption, like the myth of the pie in the sky, you know. Nonetheless, it still seems to me that the immanent apocalyptic desire that the world should come to an end kind of tacitly presumes the idea of a time when there will be no more violence and tragedy, even if we cannot yet envision it. And it's this old apocalyptic idea of a world without fears that I don't share, which is why I'd like to describe my own concept of the world as prophetic rather than apocalyptic. Because it was indeed here that prophetism and apocalypticism parted ways a little more than 2,000 years ago, namely in the concept of the world. So when apocalypticism first emerged as a genre, it carried with it the novel idea that this world is not all there is, that redemption entailed the end of this world and the inbreak of a new perfect world. By contrast, the older prophetic takes no such world beyond this one. To the prophets, there never was another world apart from this only one that we know in all its tragedy and imperfection. But this is not to say that redemption is nowhere to be found and that we are hopelessly doomed to endless imminent violence. There is transcendence and there is redemption, not in a perfect world elsewhere or beyond, but as a possibility and a calling in every moment to make this only world a little less tragic, a little less violent. This is the idea of radicality that resonates in the alternative traditions I've been referring to here. For example, in Bensaïd's talk of the will of each day, or in Buber's talk of the theopolitical hour, or in Rosenzweig's notion of the kingdom of God. And I shall end this lecture by citing the most beautiful summary of this idea that I know of, taken precisely from Rosenzweig's Star of Redemption. The kingdom of God, which again has nothing to do with the kind of evangelical idea of a world beyond. The kingdom of God is always futural, but futural it is always. It is always just as much present as it is futural. Once and for all, it is not yet there. It is coming eternally. Eternally is not a very long time, but a tomorrow that just as well could be today. Eternity is a future which, without ceasing to be a future, is nevertheless present. Eternity is a today that is conscious of being more than today. Thank you.